Imagine stepping into a newly built $100 million luxury hotel lobby, or maybe it's the global headquarters of some massive tech firm that you're visiting for a meeting. You walk through the doors and everything is, objectively flawless. The marble floors are gleaming, the architectural glass is just breathtaking, the lighting is perfectly calibrated to scream, premium. But as you stand there looking around, you get this sinking feeling, a huge wave of deja vu, because even though this space cost an absolute fortune to build, you realize you could be in Dubai, you could be in London, you could be in Shanghai or New York. It is perfectly polished and yet completely devoid of a distinct identity. It is a masterpiece of what we call the globalized beige effect. And today, we're doing a deep dive into the cure for that.
Yeah, it's a very real crisis in modern architecture right now. We are looking at environments that are undeniably luxurious in their material cost, but fundamentally structurally hollow. They are geographically anonymous.
Right. And that anonymity is the exact problem we are tackling today. Our mission for this deep dive is to explore a rigorous, highly technical solution to this modern crisis of interchangeable luxury. And it's a proprietary system called the Art-Driven Spatial Method, or ADSM. To really understand how this works, we are relying on a highly specific stack of sources today. We've got the Constellation number 75 research newsletter, a massive 86-day analytical transcript that documents the method, the official ADSM 12-chapter framework from their webpage, and the operational spatial grammars of the Alexis and Botticelli signature editions.
And before we go any further, we really need to establish our rules of engagement for this deep dive, because the moment people hear the phrase art-driven, they immediately think of interior decoration.
Oh, absolutely. Throwing some pillows on a couch.
Exactly. They think of matching couch pillows to a painting or curating a nice gallery wall in a lobby. We have to completely discard that notion. We are examining a precise industrial methodology here. This method translates the core structural logic of fine art into the actual architectural DNA of a building. It is a highly engineered system.
Okay, so to set the stage for exactly how radical this shift is, let's start with the executive summary. Based on that 12-chapter framework from the webpage, what is the core thesis of ADSM?
Well, the thesis states that contemporary luxury environments are suffering from a terminal crisis of interchangeable global architecture. Despite massive capital investment, spatial identity has collapsed into this globalized beige effect. So spaces that are perfectly polished but structurally hollow and geographically anonymous. The art-driven spatial method fundamentally restores this lost identity by utilizing culturally sovereign artworks as generative spatial DNA. This represents a radical paradigm shift from treating art as a decorative afterthought to utilizing it as structural architecture. So instead of applying art to a finished wall, the artwork's internal geometry, rhythm, and density are mathematically extracted to generate the wall itself.
Which is, that is wild to think about.
It is. And this translation of artistic intelligence into built environments is not a subjective aesthetic exercise, right? It is heavily industrialized through a proprietary 12-chapter framework. By running an artwork's logic through rigorous phases of extraction, DNA mapping, engineering, implementation, and governance, ADSM ensures that the resulting architecture is entirely authored, structurally absolute, and basically impossible to commoditize. The final environment becomes a non-replicable, three-dimensional extension of a single masterpiece.
Okay, I really want to break that down because there's a lot to process there. Translating artistic intelligence into built environments. Let's back up to the human experience of that déjà vu luxury phenomenon you mentioned. The Constellation newsletter talks extensively about this in economic terms, right? Like, in a global market, luxury has basically become a commodity.
Yeah, precisely. If you have the budget, you can source the exact same Italian marble, the exact same sleek, imported fixtures from anywhere on Earth.
Right.
And that is exactly where the market failure occurs. If you are a developer and you're paying hundreds of millions for a premium box, and your only differentiator is the cost of your materials, you've lost your competitive advantage. Money buys materials. It does not buy a narrative, and it definitely does not buy an identity.
I guess the traditional design solution to a space feeling, hollow or generic is to just throw more money at decoration, right?
Yeah.
You build the shell of the building, and then you try to make it feel special at the end. But the 86-day transcript has this brutal, brilliant analogy for why that fails.
Ah, the parsley on the plate.
Yes. It outlines the standard timeline perfectly. The architect designs the building, the interior designer picks the really expensive furniture. And then, like 2 weeks before the grand opening, someone panics because the lobby feels dead.
Right. They realize it has no soul.
Exactly. So they run out and buy a massive multi-million-dollar painting just to stick it on a blank wall. And they literally call it the parsley on the side of the plate approach.
It perfectly illustrates the flaw in contemporary spatial design. The art is treated purely as a garnish. It's just an afterthought sitting superficially on the surface of the architecture. It is not integrated into the root system of the space at all. And because it lacks structural integration, the building remains fundamentally interchangeable.
Because you could just swap the painting out.
Exactly. You could take that famous expensive painting off the wall, swap it with another one, and the building itself hasn't changed one bit. The actual spatial intelligence of the room is zero.
I hear that, but I'm struggling just a little bit with the premise that all modern luxury architecture is just a premium box. I mean, if I look at the work of top-tier global architects, they were designing incredibly bespoke, crazy, wild structures. They aren't just stamping out square carbon copies, right? How are the best architects in the world still guilty of this interchangeable space problem?
It's a vital distinction to make. They aren't stamping out carbon copies in terms of literal, square floor plans,
Yeah.
but they are utilizing the exact same globalized vocabulary of form and material. The difference here is between surface and structure.
Okay, explain that.
Well, a bespoke, sweeping curve on a glass facade or a custom-milled reception desk might be unique to that specific building, but the underlying spatial logic, how the space is actually organized and generated, is still derived from the same standardized, efficiency-driven architectural software.
I see.
It's basically bespoke tailoring, but it's draped over the exact same mannequin. The art-driven spatial method dictates that to truly cure this identity deficit, you cannot just change the suit. You have to change the DNA of the mannequin itself.
Okay, so that leads directly into the fundamental principle of ADSM. Because surface-level decoration fails to create real identity, this method forces a complete 180-degree reversal of the traditional timeline.
Yes,
Art does not come in at the end to cover a blank wall. Art is day one.
that is the pivotal inversion of the whole system. Before a single site map is drawn, before any structural grid is laid out by some engineer, a specific sovereign artwork is selected. That single piece of art becomes the generative spatial DNA for the entire built environment.
Now, I need to stop and clarify something for you, the listener, because when I first read the phrase art-driven, my mind immediately went to a mood board.
Most people's minds do.
Right. I thought, okay, we pick a painting of a stormy ocean. It feels moody and blue, so the designer picks wavy furniture and dark blue carpets. But the sources are militant about the fact that this is not a mood board.
No, treating art as a mood board is exactly the trap traditional designers fall into. That is subjective inspiration. ADSM operates on structural translation.
Which is completely different.
Very different. Inspiration is looking at a painting and borrowing its vibe. Structural translation involves treating the artwork as a highly complex, codified dataset.
So we aren't looking at the paint, we are looking at the math behind the paint.
Exactly. We are extracting the mathematical cadence of the brushstrokes. We are mapping the density of the pigment. We are analyzing the geometric tension between the focal points on the canvas. The artwork is a data source, not a color palette.
It's almost like taking a two-dimensional painting, digitizing it, and just exploding it into 3 dimensions. So you aren't just standing in a room looking at a piece of art, you're physically inhabiting the internal logic of the art itself.
That is the absolute perfect way to visualize it. You are walking through its structural logic. And because it is structural, this method does not require contemporary abstract art to work. The framework relies on artworks that possess a strong, resonant internal logic. So you can use a 16th century Renaissance oil painting or a Baroque masterpiece to generate a highly futuristic, ultra-modern corporate headquarters.
Right, because it's about the underlying structure, not the literal subject matter.
Yeah.
If you use a classical painting of a historical battle scene, the architectural translation doesn't mean you, hang swords and shields on the lobby walls.
Doing that would reduce architecture to a theme park.
Yeah, exactly.
Instead, ADSM analyzes the invisible vectors of tension in that battle composition. Like, how did the artist direct the viewer's eye? Where is the clustering of mass? What is the spatial void between the central figures? That abstract data is what actually generates the volumetric space of the room.
Okay, I completely buy the concept of living inside the logic of a painting. But a canvas is flat, and a building is physical. There has to be a bridge where the art actually becomes architecture. How does that translation physically happen?
The bridge is a rigorous technical process called morphological analysis. This is really the technical core of the art-driven spatial method. In biology, morphology is the study of the form and structure of organisms. In ADSM, it is the study of the form and structure of the artwork.
Breaking it down into parts.
Yes, it involves breaking the visual field down into its foundational components: lines, textures, color fields, and visual densities.
And I appreciate that the Constellation newsletter heavily grounds this in 20th century visual science. They aren't just making this up in a vacuum. They're building on a massive theoretical lineage. They cite Wassily Kandinsky, specifically his 1925 book, Point and Line to Plane.
Kandinsky is foundational here, because he wasn't just painting abstract shapes, he was theorizing the psychological and spatial impact of geometry. Take a painting of his like yellow, red, blue. It is a prime example of how rigid lines colliding with soft, amorphous curves create a specific vibratory impact on the viewer. ADSM takes Kandinsky's theories and asks an engineering question. What if you could physically walk through that collision of geometry?
They also cite Paul Klee's pedagogical sketchbook, where he talked about a line going for a walk, and Joseph Alber's interaction of color, which proved that color shapes our literal perception of spatial depth, and Rudolf Arnheim's work on visual perception.
All of them.
These are the pioneers who proved that shapes and rhythms are literally a structural language.
Yes, and ADSM operationalizes that language. Let's look at a concrete example from the 86-day transcript to show how this morphological analysis physically works in the real world. Imagine a classical landscape painting. In the background, there's a tree. The artist didn't just slap a solid block of green paint on the canvas, right?
Right, they use strokes.
Exactly. They used a specific rhythm of brush strokes, a density of short, choppy strokes to render the foliage.
So there's a mathematical cadence to how the artist applied the paint.
Through ADSM, that specific rhythm, the spacing, the density, the repetition of those brushstrokes is mathematically mapped out. That data is then translated directly into the building's infrastructure. For instance, it becomes the blueprint for the ceiling lighting.
Wait, really? The physical lights?
Yes. Instead of placing recessed ceiling lights in a standard, arbitrary, grid-like pattern that an office contractor would normally use, the lights are spaced according to the exact rhythm of those brushstrokes.
Oh, wow.
The physical intervals between the light fixtures, the intensity of the lumens, the specific way the shadows fall on the floor, all of it is dictated by the density data of the art.
So you could be walking down a corridor, and the light filtering down on you feels uniquely organic, almost dappled. You might not consciously realize it, but you are literally walking underneath the physical, architectural manifestation of the artist's brushwork. That is incredible, and the transcript details how they do the exact same thing with color, right? Translating a chromatic gradient into a physical journey.
Exactly. Let's say the source artwork features a chromatic gradient that transitions from a deep, dense shadow on the left side of the canvas into a bright, luminous highlight on the right. ADSM translates that visual gradient into a spatial sequence.
So the floor plan itself becomes a physical mirror of that color transition.
Yes.
So how does that dictate materials, practically speaking?
Well, you might enter the environment on a dark, highly polished granite representing that shadow. As you move deeper into the space, the material physically transitions to match the gradient. The dark granite gives way to a softer, medium-toned limestone, which eventually lightens into a pure, highly reflective white marble at the core of the building. Your physical movement through the architecture is literally executing the color logic of the painting.
Okay, but this is where I start to get a little skeptical about the implementation of all this. Turning Kandinsky's theories and 17th century brushstrokes into a functional skyscraper or a luxury hotel requires an insane level of organization. You can't just hand a construction form in a spreadsheet of colors and say, hey, go make this hallway feel like a painting. It would be chaos.
It would be an absolute failure, which is exactly why the ADSM webpage outlines a highly rigid 12-chapter industrial protocol.
Right.
This is where the philosophy becomes a proprietary industrial engine. The ADSM is structured across 5 distinct phases, encompassing 12 chapters. Every single step is an operational architectural process. The entire point of this framework is to prevent the original artistic DNA from being diluted, misinterpreted, or corrupted during the brutal reality of construction.
Since this framework is the supreme authority for how this works, I want to walk through this chapter by chapter. Phase I is extraction. This is essentially where the mining happens, right?
Correct. Phase I begins with Chapter 01, Artistic Extraction 1. This is the source selection. The process starts by identifying a sovereign masterpiece. The absolute key requirement here is that the artwork must possess a structural and emotional logic resonant enough to generate an entire spatial world. You cannot use a weak composition.
So you can't just pick a pretty landscape that lacks depth.
Exactly. It needs to have dense, usable data.
Then Chapter O2 is artistic extraction 2. This is the structural extraction.
This is the morphological analysis we just discussed in detail. It is the systematic decoding of the artwork's geometry, rhythm, density, and chromatic universe into a generative matrix. It is the extraction of the raw data.
Okay, so once we have that raw data, we move to Phase 2, DNA mapping. Chapter O3 is defining signature identity. What does that mean in practical terms?
In Chapter O3, that raw extracted data is translated into modular, deployable identity components. The abstract numbers and vectors are shaped into tangible spatial rules. So if the data shows a high density of sharp colliding vectors, this chapter defines the rule that the space must utilize acute angles and hard material transitions.
And then Chapter O4 is narrative architecture. I found this fascinating when I was reading the webpage. This is the construction of spatial sequencing. It's essentially treating the building like a story.
Yes, exactly. The plot of the building, how a person moves from the entrance through the transition zones into the main lobby and finally to the private suites, is structured to match the visual flow and narrative logic of the original canvas.
So it's choreographing the walking path.
Right. If the painting draws the eye slowly from the bottom left to a sudden explosive focal point in the top right, the architecture must force the inhabitant to walk through a compressed, quiet corridor that suddenly opens into a massive, voluminous atrium.
We are mirroring the eye's journey with the body's journey. That's brilliant. Now, Phase 3, engineering. This is where the math really takes over. Chapter O5 is symbolic logic.
Symbolic logic involves encoding meaning through proprietary grid proportions. The actual structural grid of the building, where the structural columns are placed, the actual dimensions of the rooms, is aligned mathematically with the artistic rhythm extracted back in Phase 1.
So even the distance between the pillars is art-driven.
Absolutely.
And
Yes.
Chapter O6 is emotional temperature. I'll be honest, that sounds a bit subjective for an industrial framework.
It sounds subjective, but it is highly calibrated. This is where ADSM maps the experiential intensity of the artwork and dictates the physical responses of the building.
Give me an example of that.
Well, if the focal point of the painting is emotionally intense and chaotic, how do the acoustics of the room reflect that? How does the tactile feel of the wall panels or the warmth of the lighting match that specific intensity?
Oh, I see. So an intense red focal point might translate to an acoustically live room with hard surfaces that reflect sound, whereas a soft blue area in the painting translates to a room with heavy, sound-absorbing fabrics.
Exactly. It dictates the physics of the room. And this leads directly into Chapter O7, spatial rhythm. This governs volumetric modulation. It dictates the physical height and scale of the rooms and the circulation intervals between them, ensuring the pacing of the architecture strictly matches the pacing of the art.
Okay, here is where my skepticism really kicks in. Phase 4 is implementation. Chapter O8 is functional integration. Because eventually a building has to be a building, right?
It does.
It needs HVAC systems, it needs plumbing, it needs fire escapes. If I'm a developer, I can't let the brushstrokes of a 17th century painting dictate where my fire exits go. Doesn't this whole art-driven method fall apart under real-world engineering codes?
That is the ultimate test of the system, and exactly why Chapter O8 exists. It is the rigorous alignment of the artistic logic with unyielding operational and safety requirements.
So how do they reconcile that?
Well, the artistic DNA does not override safety codes. Rather, the DNA is used to creatively solve the engineering constraints.
Oh, interesting.
Right. So if a fire code dictates a massive structural shear wall in a certain location, ADSM doesn't try to just hide it with drywall. It interrogates the artwork's data to determine how that massive wall should be shaped, textured, and lit so that it feels like an intentional, generative part of the spatial narrative.
It integrates the reality rather than fighting it. That makes sense. Moving on, Chapter O9 is materials and finishes.
This is where the chromatic and density data from the artwork are finally materialized into physical specifications. It's the translation of color gradients into the specific porosity of limestone versus the high gloss of marble that we discussed earlier.
And Chapter 10 is lighting and atmosphere. The framework specifically says it applies proprietary luminance logic scripts.
Yes, instead of standard lighting design, the system uses algorithms to dictate atmospheric continuity. It ensures the lighting rhythm we talked about, the brushstroke cadence, is maintained consistently across different times of day and natural light conditions.
Finally, we reach Phase V, governance. I'm assuming this is to make sure the execution doesn't get sloppy at the finish line. Chapter 11 is signature detailing.
We are talking about the extreme microscale here. The micro patterns milled into the wood joinery, the specific tactile grip of the door hardware, everything down to the hinges must be traceable back to the generative artistic DNA.
So the door handle isn't just a handle, it's a piece of the painting's geometry.
Exactly.
And the final step, Chapter 12, value creation and legacy. This is basically the business end of the framework.
It is the quantification of the pricing power and cultural impact. By strictly following this 12-chapter framework, the developer ensures that the final architectural asset is structurally absolute. It proves mathematically that the space is impossible to copy.
Looking at this entire 12-chapter process, I can't help but think of it like a massive industrial software compiler.
A software compiler is honestly the most accurate analogy for ADSM.
Because you are taking a deeply emotional, profoundly human piece of fine art, basically the source code, and feeding it into this strict 12-chapter industrial compiler to generate a totally uncorrupted physical matrix. It strips out the subjective guesswork of human contractors.
It has to be industrial. If the process allowed for subjective interpretation by an interior designer or a junior architect on the site, the beige effect would instantly creep back in.
Right, because they'd inject their own generic tastes.
Exactly. The designer would say, oh, I think this wall should be green, and suddenly the structural logic is broken. The 12 chapters ensure the artistic DNA survives the brutal reality of the construction site.
So where is this spatial software actually being deployed? The sources list some incredibly demanding application domains for ADSM.
The primary sectors targeted by this methodology are environments where high capital is invested and identity is paramount. We are talking about luxury hospitality, major cultural institutions, massive corporate headquarters, and ultra-high net worth private residences.
But what really caught my eye in the Constellation newsletter is what they call the extreme test, the most difficult application of all: maritime and aerospace, super yachts, commercial cruise vessels, and aviation interiors like private jets.
Those environments represent the absolute frontier for spatial design. The engineering constraints in maritime and aerospace are absolute and unforgiving.
Yeah, I imagine.
A private jet or a 100-meter super yacht is essentially a highly engineered tube. Every millimeter of space is dictated by weight restrictions, aerodynamics, hydrodynamics, and brutal safety protocols.
Right, and because of those extreme constraints, I feel like every private jet or yacht interior looks exactly the same. They just feel like sterile machines that have been dressed up with expensive white leather and high-gloss wood to look like a living room. You walk onto a super yacht and it's just a floating hotel lobby.
Precisely. They are the ultimate expression of interchangeable luxury. But applying ADSM to that environment fundamentally changes the paradigm. The transcript refers to this as introducing controlled, beautiful chaos.
How does that actually work inside a tube, though?
Imagine taking the density data from a dynamic 17th century painting and using it to dictate the physical curvature of a yacht's internal bulkhead.
Okay.
Instead of a flat, sterile wall dictated by an engineer, the wall bows and curves according to the tension in the artwork. It shatters that sterile, machine-like feeling. It transforms a machine designed for transport into a fully inhabited spatial narrative.
And if I'm a client spending $100 million on a super yacht, the value proposition there is massive.
Yeah.
At that level of wealth, predictability is a failure. You don't want your yacht to look exactly like your billionaire neighbor's yacht.
No, the ultimate currency at that level is non-replicability. Because ADSM provides a traceable origin to a single sovereign artwork, it mathematically guarantees that the asset cannot be copied. A competitor cannot replicate the yacht's unique spatial intelligence without literally stealing the original painting and running it through the exact same 12-chapter extraction protocol.
Okay, so zooming out from the super yachts for a second, what does this all mean for the future of how we build? We started with the problem of the generic globalized lobby. We've walked through this incredibly rigorous 12-chapter solution. What is the ultimate outcome of ADSM?
The outcome is the creation of structurally authored environments.
Authored, not just designed.
Exactly. Spaces that are not merely designed, but authored in the same way a masterpiece is painted or a novel is written. ADSM produces spatial identities that are structurally absolute. The environments are derived from a single artistic logic, forming a fully integrated spatial system, from the macro circulation down to the micro pattern on the door handles. It fundamentally and permanently rejects the reliance on decorative overlays.
I have to bring up the looming threat of artificial intelligence here. Because we hear so much about AI and procedural generation in architecture, and AI can instantly design a highly efficient, perfectly polished building. But it feels to me like AI could make the global beige effect exponentially worse. It could basically automate soullessness.
That is arguably the most acute risk in contemporary architecture right now. AI models excel at optimization and mimicry, but what are they mimicking?
Whatever they were trained on.
Right, they're trained on a data set of existing buildings. Therefore, AI naturally produces an average of all existing data. It is the literal definition of beige. It optimizes toward the generic.
So how does ADSM counter that?
ADSM acts as a profound safeguard against algorithmic homogenization. While the 12-chapter framework functions like a highly engineered algorithm, its input, the generative seed, is profoundly human. It relies entirely on a sovereign masterpiece embedded with human emotion, cultural history, and artistic genius.
It's using the extreme rigor of an algorithm to protect the soul of human art.
Exactly. The final philosophical core of this method is that architecture becomes a three-dimensional extension of a single artwork's internal logic.
Now, to prove that this isn't just theoretical philosophy, we really have to look at the ADSM's signature series demonstrators. The sources specifically highlight two of these, the Alexis edition and the Botticelli edition. And I want to be extremely precise here for you, the listener. These are not descriptions of physical real estate ventures. They are not hotel projects you can go pick a room in. They operate purely as spatial grammar systems to validate the structural polarities of ADSM.
Yes, they must be understood strictly as operational expressions of the ADSM generative system. They prove the flexibility of the method. Let's examine the Alexis edition first.
The Alexis edition validates what they call the vectorial spatial logic.
Correct. The Alexis edition validates the infrastructural, geometric, and vectorial logic layer of the method. The spatial rules extracted here are highly mathematical. It demonstrates how ADSM translates structural codes into macro-scale spatial organization, specifically for high-traffic environments like transport hubs or vertical skyscrapers.
I read the technical logic listed for Alexis, and it uses terms like binodal logic, floor management, and tensile acoustic buffers. And I want to stop on that last one, because tensile acoustic buffers sounds like something out of a submarine manual. What does that actually mean for a person walking through a space?
It's a perfect example of ADSM mechanics. In a traditional high-traffic space, if it gets too loud, a designer will just slap generic acoustic foam panels on the ceiling. But under the Alexis edition grammar, a tensile acoustic buffer means the geometric angles extracted from the artwork are used to physically shape the architectural wall panels.
Oh, so the walls themselves are doing the work.
Yes. The walls themselves are angled and tensioned to catch, diffuse, and absorb sound waves naturally. The geometry itself solves the acoustic problem.
So it's the skeleton. It's highly rigid, very organized infrastructural logic.
Exactly. It proves that ADSM can generate highly complex data-driven environments based on sharp vectorial geometry. Now contrast that with the Botticelli edition. This grammar system is derived from Sandro Botticelli's famous painting, Primavera.
Primavera is a Renaissance masterpiece. It's a horizontally staged mythological scene, very soft, very flowing.
Yes, and therefore the Botticelli engine represents the compositional, atmospheric, and narrative continuity layer. Because Primavera features a continuous processional field of figures across the canvas, the ADSM framework translates that into a completely different spatial grammar than Alexis.
So instead of the rigid vectorial nodes of Alexis, the Botticelli system translates that Renaissance art into what the sources call classical clustering, horizontal promenades, and lateral narrative flow.
Precisely. It dictates a soft, luminous atmosphere and a spatial hierarchy based on walking procession. If the Alexis edition is the skeleton and infrastructural geometry of a building, the Botticelli edition is the breath, the atmosphere, and the narrative flow.
But both are formal extensions of the exact same 12-chapter ADSM methodology.
That is the crucial takeaway. They brilliantly validate the structural polarity of the system. They prove that depending entirely on the source DNA, whether the artwork demands strict vectorial infrastructure or luminous continuous harmony, the ADSM framework can operationalize it.
It just shows the immense power of treating art as structural DNA rather than just a poster on a wall. Thank you so much for breaking down the mechanics of this. I have to admit, you have fundamentally changed how I will look at buildings from now on. I'm going to be looking for the beige effect everywhere.
It is a methodology that demands we look deeper than the surface. It challenges us to demand more from the spaces we inhabit and to reject the idea that luxury just means expensive materials.
And that leads me to a final, slightly provocative thought for you, our listener. I have an experiment for you to try right now. Look around the space you are in at this exact moment. Maybe it's your office, maybe it's your living room, or maybe you are sitting in one of those generic hotel lobbies we talked about at the start. If you had to reverse engineer the room you are in right now, if you had to feed the spacing of those ceiling lights above your head, the transitions of the floor materials beneath your feet, and the physical geometric shape of the walls back into the ADSM 12-chapter matrix, what would the resulting painting look like? Would it be a complex, vibrant, emotionally resonant masterpiece? Or would it just be a blank, completely beige canvas? It's an exciting, if slightly terrifying thought. We have the history and we have the art. We just need to start using it as our DNA. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.